Massimo Pigliucci, it's good to see you.
Hi, nice seeing you again.
Welcome to the Sophia audience. Why don't we do our introductions and we can get started with our topic for today. Massimo, why don't you go first?
I'm Massimo Pigliucci, the KD Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York.
And author of the newly produced, just published, and wildly successful How to Be a Stoic, which we had a very nice and interesting discussion about last time.
Yes.
I'm Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University. I just turned in my final grades on Monday, and so now this is why I have the generally homeless shelter sort of look about my living space, as I am committed to doing absolutely nothing for a week.
Right.
Before I
Good
start
idea.
getting involved in writing projects. Massimo, are you done also?
Yes, that's right. Monday was the exam final grades day, and that was it. Yeah.
All right, good. So we have a spring in our step, is what.
That's right.
Is
At least for a while.
Right. Okay, so today our ostensive subject today is teleological explanations in biology, but there's an ulterior motive, and so if you don't mind, let me just for a second frame what I had in mind, why I wanted to talk to you about this.
Right.
And it is connected to all the stuff on virtue ethics that we've been doing. So it's not a secret to anybody who reads my magazine or who watches us that I've been very influenced by Elizabeth Anscombe. And Elizabeth Anscombe wrote this very important paper in the 50s called Modern Moral Philosophy, where she suggests that there's a certain basic problem with contemporary moral philosophy because it is attempting to talk about values and obligations without, in the absence of any belief in natural teleology. That there's purpose in nature, and specifically that there's a human purpose. This, of course, critique was then picked up by Alistair MacIntyre in perhaps a more well-known book, After Virtue. Now, a lot of people took Anscombe to be saying, well, then let's go back and do virtue ethics again. Right. But Anscombe herself warns against the possibility of that option, partly because it's not just virtue ethics that's missing in modern moral philosophy. It's also the what she calls the divine command element of ethics that's missing. But with respect to the virtue ethics in particular, she says that, and this is somewhat cryptic, but she says that until we have an adequate philosophy of psychology, we should probably not talk about morals. And the sense that I get from her from reading that paper is that she doesn't think that the recovering some notion of teleology is going to be very easy in a modern context. Partly because modern science has largely eschewed teleological explanations, but I also wonder, and maybe we'll get into this, whether biology is even the science to where we should be looking, or whether it's some sort of psychology to which we should be looking, or even maybe a biological psychology to which we should be looking. And so those are all the sorts of issues that I have in mind in the background to why. Now, you have been very strong in saying, you're very strongly a virtue ethicist, so you obviously think that virtue ethics is recoverable in the modern context. Right. And you've also argued pretty strongly that biology simply cannot be done without teleological explanations. And so what I want to finally get down to is whether indeed biology really does employ teleological explanations, or whether they're only sort of instrumentally teleological. And secondly, even if it does, whether we can get a sufficiently thick notion of human purpose out of it upon which to base a modern virtue ethic. So that's the ulterior motive behind mine.
So before we get into the discussion, and I give you my take about two issues, really. I think there are two separate issues here, at least. One is to what extent does modern biology recover a teleological, a sense of teleology? I don't think actually it does. I think it recovers a sense of teleonomy,
right?
Not teleology. So we'll get into the distinction
yes.
in a minute. And then a separate question in my mind, unlike Anscombe, is whether there is any value in either the modern approach to ethics or the virtue ethical approach of ethics, independently of their two alleged weaknesses, which are respectively the idea of a law imposed by a lawgiver in one case, or some kind of robust sense of teleology in the other case. I'm going to argue later on that actually those are their historical roots, but that they're actually not needed conceptually.
Okay,
but,
great. That's great.
Right. So, but before we get there, you want to sort of put this in the context of Aristotle and the four causes and all
Yeah.
that
So I think there's independent interest in the question of teleological
right.
explanations, and we have had a whole separate dialogue in where you suggest that you do think that the modern notion of causality is too narrow,
Right.
and so I would like to hear you talk about maybe a little bit about the four causes and where they went. We did this little dialogue on this, but very quickly, and then spend the bulk of it on to what extent we have to engage purposes and explanations in modern biology.
Right. So why don't we give the classic example of a statue as to explain the difference between the four causes. So Aristotle famously gave a classification of four. Aristotle was famously into classifications. He really loved taxonomy.
Yeah.
The four causes, the 12 virtues, et cetera, et cetera. He had a sort of systematic mind, which actually made him a very good early biologist when he went and spent a lot of time doing field work, which many people don't appreciate. He actually did. But in terms of causes, first of all, the word cause here is kind of weird, because I think that it's fair to say that Aristotle did not mean what we mean today by cause, certainly not post-Hume. He actually meant something more akin, I think, to what we mean by explanation.
Yes.
Right. So these are four different kinds of explanations of whatever you want to account for, and they are not mutual. They're not meant to be mutually exclusive. They're different aspects of a fuller explanation. So typically when I introduce that to my students in intro philosophy, I use the classic example of a statue or a sculptor that is getting a statue basically out of a piece of marble, initially undifferentiated piece of marble, right? So the idea is this: there are four causes, the formal cause, the final cause, the efficient cause, and the material cause. And the efficient cause, well, let's start with the material cause. Actually, material cause is the marble or whatever thing the statue is eventually going to be made of. Let's say marble in this case. The efficient cause is whatever process gets from the original undifferentiated state to the final state. So in this case, the sculptor himself is the efficient cause. The formal cause is essentially what it is that the statue is supposed to look like, right? It starts out as an undifferentiated piece of marble, but it's supposed to look like something, like a famous politician, for instance, or a philosopher, or whatever it is. And the final cause is the reason why all of this is happening. For instance, because the city of Athens asked the sculptor to produce the statue in order to honor a particular politician or a particular philosopher, right? So those are the four causes. Now, in modern science, often people say that we basically retain the material causes, right? We do retain the efficient causes, but the both formal and final causes are gone. And particularly with Darwin, people say, "Oh, there's no final purpose. There's no purpose to the whole thing. It's just there's just the appearance of purpose." Right. So my eyes, for instance, you can reasonably say that they have a function, and that function is to see. Or my heart has a function. The function is not to make noise, but even though it does also make noise, but to pump blood, and so on and so forth, right? But those functions don't require a final cause, meaning they don't require some kind of forethought or plan about what's about to happen. And that's what most people mean by teleology. So a teleological take on things is the idea that there is a purpose, that there is a plan going on that is unfolding, that the other causes help to bring about. Now, modern biology and most modern science, I think, certainly rejects the idea of an ultimate purpose or a sort of a teleological, strong sense of teleology. But ever since at least Jacques Monod, who was an interesting fellow, he was a Nobel Prize winner, French biologist, who back in 1970, I think, wrote this wonderful book that is a little bit underappreciated today, but I think it still makes for a great reading, Chance and Necessity, where he wrote that in biology, actually, you do have something that approaches teleology, but it's actually teleonomy. That is, it's the appearance of purpose, which explains how you get biological function. So basically, Monod said, look, it makes perfect sense. It is perfectly scientifically legitimate to talk about the fact that the eyes and the blood and the heart have a function, unlike, let's say, a rock or a planet or a star. Right? So there is this dichotomy in nature where structures of living organisms that have evolved by natural selection do have a function. It makes perfect sense. It's not just a metaphor that people talk about. If you don't actually talk about a function of the eye, you don't understand the eye. If you just give a purely descriptive account of the eye, it's like, oh, it's made in a certain way with certain chemicals and so on and so forth. You say, yeah, okay, but what does it do? For the eye, or for any complex biological structure, it makes sense to ask the question, well, what does it do? What is it for? Well, on the other hand, for inanimate objects, it doesn't.
Right. It doesn't make sense to ask that about Pluto, right?
That's right. If you ask about a planet or a star or a galaxy, what is it for? Well, it's not for anything. It just is, right? So Monod reintroduced, basically, he wasn't the only one, but he's one of the major authors back in 1960s and 70s too. So he reintroduced this concept of teleonomy, so a milder version of teleology, basically. So there is no plan as in the sense of an intelligent designer, as in the case of the statue, where clearly the sculptor is an intelligent designer. But there is a robust sense in which the process of natural selection, the phenomenon of natural selection, brings about biological function. It makes sense to talk about it. Now, you're right, however, that I think it's very sensible, on the other hand, to use a robust sense of teleology when we're talking about social sciences. Right? In the case of human psychology, human sociology, human economics, and so on and so forth, certain things happen not just because they have a function. I mean, the markets have a function, or the iPad that I have in front of me and I'm talking to you through has a function, but they have a function that is the result of intelligent design. It really is directly analogous to the sculptor, right? And the people do these things on purpose, even though then some of the things that we do in society, especially aspects of economics, for instance, are actually the result of sort of automatic byproduct of human decisions. But nonetheless, there is human decision involved. It's not like economists or politicians or policymakers decide every single aspect of the economy consciously. Obviously, they don't. But the fact that we do have economic policies and we talk about economics and models about economics and so on and so forth means that these are actually purposive things in the robust sense of purposive. I mean, there is an intelligent designer there, right? So I think that actually the way I come to see it, the distinction between teleology, teleonomy, and none of the above is actually the distinction, the fault line, if there is any, between the social sciences, where a robust sense of teleology applies, the biological sciences, where robust teleology does not apply, but teleonomy does, and everything else, all the other sciences, chemistry, geology, physics, etc., where neither teleology nor teleonomy actually apply. Does that make sense to you?
No, it makes. I love it. I love it, and I actually I'm really fascinated by the way we divide the various sciences and looking for a sort of a heuristic by which to sort of character. And I like this idea that we can cluster the sciences under the sort of primary types of explanation or the
right.
I think that's really. But let me just ask you a few things about this, just to get clear, because we indeed have talked about ethics before. So I did want to spend the bulk of this on the actual sciences.
Right.
So first of all, about Aristotle. Now, I want to be sure that we get Aristotle right, because it's not clear to me that by purpose Aristotle means something quite as strong as the way you characterize the sculptor, because for Aristotle's God is non-personified, right? The
Yes.
prime mover is non-personified, and so it's not as if purpose in nature for Aristotle is to be construed in this crude sense of something being intended, right? That's the extent to which I think the religious adoption of Aristotle mischaracterized him, right?
Right.
And so I guess what I would want to ask you, do you think that Aristotle really is talking about teleonomy?
Yeah, right.
Or do you think that there's something either in between full-blown intentional teleology in the sense of something intended,
Right.
and is there something in between those two, or how do you see that?
That's a good question. And then you're right, absolutely, that Aristotle did not, Aristotle's prime mover doesn't have anything to do with an intelligent designer, in the Christian
It's not
sense of the
God
term.
creating the cosmos
No.
the way it is in Genesis. Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
But Aristotle himself does use examples like the sculptor. So it's far. I'm not an Aristotle scholar, so don't quote me on it. Oh, right, we're on video that it's going to be seen by thousands of people. Oh well.
I'm not criticizing the metaphor. I'm just asking whether Aristotle has, when he's talking about nature, strictly speaking.
Yeah. Well, I think
biology.
Right. I think it's reasonable to actually say that Aristotle may have been ambiguous about it. That is, that you're right that the Aristotle's prime mover does not have that strong sense of teleology. In fact, it could basically be interpreted as a particular version of teleonomy. Even that, I think, is a sense of teleonomy that we don't that modern science does not accept, because he did not limit it to biology. He included everything, including
physics. I'll get to that in a minute, but let me ask you, just let's pretend we're only talking about biology. How would you differentiate what you're calling teleonomy from what Aristotle meant, as opposed to, let's say, a medieval Christian Aristotelian, right?
Right. No, I wouldn't. That's right. I wouldn't. So if we're sticking to biology, I think that Aristotle is essentially talking about what we're talking now today, we're calling today teleonomy. Okay. What makes it ambiguous, I think, is both his use of metaphors like, examples like the sculptor, which is clearly intelligent, an example of intelligent design, and also the fact that he applies his concept more broadly to the entire cosmos. And now we don't think, some people do, I suppose, but most scientists don't think that the cosmos has anything like the teleonomic aspect that biology presents. I mean, there are exceptions, right?
That's what I wanted to ask you about next. So you mentioned geology.
Right.
Are there not complex systems that operate at the geological level that are kind of hard to do the science without appealing to? Systems, let's say, between, I don't know, land and water systems, or
right.
So how would you pull all that apart?
Right. So that's a good question. So some not only geologists, but actually some biologists or some scientists that work at the interface between the two. For instance, community and ecosystem ecologists. Right. So these are people who are essentially biologists by training. So they're ecologists, but what they are interested in is the interface between the biological world and the geophysical world, right? So they talk about, as you say, water cycles, for instance, or mineral cycles and things like that, and within the biosphere. And they often do use language that sounds teleological or at least teleonomic, because they talk about, for instance, ecosystem services, right? So they say, the recycling of water, the recycling of minerals is what makes possible for the biosphere to function in a certain way.
Right, or to create certain kind of atmospheres that then things can live in, and so on and so forth.
Exactly. But I do think but I actually have been pushing back against these people for using that language. I think
Explain why.
Well, I think that's a sloppy metaphor, because while we do, let's take the example of oxygen in the atmosphere. That's a perfect example. So, our life as we understand it today on this planet is made possible in part by the fact that there is oxygen, breathable oxygen, and we are the kind of animals, the kind of organisms that breathe oxygen. But of course, the early atmosphere did not have oxygen, or had very little oxygen. And oxygen is actually the result of biological processes. It's something that gets discarded by plants during photosynthesis, right? Which means that if photosynthesis worked in a different way, we would have never had a oxygen type atmosphere, and therefore the entire course of evolution on Earth would have been different. Well, so what? Meaning there was no particular rhyme or reason for why that was the case. That's why I use the word byproduct. It's not like natural selection or anything like it actually preferred a planet with oxygen rather than a planet without oxygen. On the other hand, the evolution of structures like the eye is the result of a process where there is a competition, and the animals that have even rudimentary eyes and or ways to perceive light, they actually do get ahead. They reproduce, they survive better than others, right? So the biology of complex systems, complex organs does have an answer to, okay, how do we get these functions? Well, that's natural selection. There's no equivalent answer at the ecosystem level. There's nothing like that at the ecosystem level, unless you buy into what I think are fringe ideas, like the Gaia hypothesis.
Did you say fringe or French?
French. Yeah, I'm sorry. French.
I had to say that. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
You're right that the French often do have fringe ideas.
Have interesting ideas. Right? I'm gonna get murdered for that in the comments. Right.
I know.
Yeah, go on. That's very interesting.
It's funny you actually mentioned the French. Open parenthesis. I just finishing a contribution to a new book on the Darwinian traditions, meaning that something that traces the evolution of Darwinism, if you will. And one of the chapters is about the French take during the 20th century about evolutionary theory. And a lot of French biologists are still talking about Lamarck as if it were a viable thing. So the French are French sometimes. But back to the French. So the Gaia hypothesis is something that was produced, elaborated in the 1960s and 70s. And it's been accepted only by a very small number of people, like Lynn Margulis was one of the most controversial biologists who actually bought into it. But most biologists just think at best, Gaia is a metaphor. Gaia meaning that the planet should be thought of as itself as a living organism. It's a metaphor. And I think it's a bad metaphor. There's no equivalent at the planetary level of natural selection. It's not like, an organism. If you think of the planet Earth as an organism, well, okay, in which environment is it competing with? And with other planets or for resources. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. There's no mechanism underlying this thing. So that's why I reject teleonomic talk or talk of function, even at the ecosystem level, and let alone, therefore, at the geophysical level.
Okay, so so let me just press one more a little bit, and then we'll move on, because this strikes me as being actually one of the crucial issues. I see the problem, and part of the problem also with the sort of the ecosystem sort of level of discussion is that it's, of course, adulterated by the biological, which is teleonomic, right?
Yes.
So I actually was thinking of it at a much lower level than that. So, for example, what's wrong with seeing with talking of a chemical reaction as an end? As an end in the teleonomic sense of an end. You've said to me, and I'm sure you were speaking metaphorically, but again, I want you to explain why, that there's something very special about carbon, that it bonds and this is why probably we can't make silicon mines,
right?
Or very likely we won't be able to make silicon mines. But this idea that sort of, that certain chemicals interact in certain ways to have certain results. If we're not talking about teleology in the sense of intending something, what is wrong with speaking of those end states as ends? Yeah. And speaking of that, using that in an explanatory way, what is wrong with talking that way?
Well, I think what's wrong with it is that there's no mechanism that would explain in what robust sense those things have functions. So let's take the example of chemical reactions, right? So if you take a simple chemical reaction that occurs, naturally outside of biological systems, as many chemical reactions do, right? Then the question of, well, what is that for, wouldn't even arise. I mean, no chemist goes around saying, well, I wonder why is it that this particular chemical reaction happens under these conditions. They go about the question in terms of how does it happen. They want to figure out how the thing works, but they don't ask themselves why. Now, on the other hand, take a chemical reaction, a complex biochemical reaction that happens inside a living organism, right? Such as something that has to do with hemoglobin exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Well, there you can still ask the same kind of question the chemist asks, how does it work? But you would be definitely missing something if you were not also asking the question the biologist asked, which is, well, why is that thing working that way? What's the function? What is the purpose of it, right? And there is a purpose there. There is a question of oxygenating your blood, which of course does have an effect on your ability to survive and reproduce, and which is why, of course, natural selection favored certain chemical reactions or arrangements of chemical reactions within living organisms. Now, there are some people who would make that case at a cosmic level, but they're very rare, and usually they're not scientists. Like the most important one probably recently is Thomas Nagel, who wrote, the NYU philosopher who wrote this book that got really severely criticized by a number of scientists.
Yeah, it got panned, yeah.
And basically, Nagel is saying, look, modern science is missing something. It's missing it has to recover a sense of teleology. Otherwise, we can't make sense of, why there is consciousness, why there is intelligent beings and things like that.
Yeah.
And, I respect Nagel. I mean, Nagel is a really smart guy.
I kind of wish he hadn't gotten so panned. I mean, I guess I wish that there was room for people to speculate a little more.
Sure.
Without just being absolutely driven back underground, because I think the result ultimately is that people are just not going to ask these questions, which I don't know if I think is a good thing. But anyway.
Right. No, I agree. And by the way, that kind of question was perfectly legitimate in physics and biology not that long ago. So, and of course, Nagel is onto something there, meaning that it does, it is true that we still have no clue to how life itself evolved to begin with. Is it possible? We have no idea. I mean, there's plenty of theories about it, but we don't know. And we have even less of a clue about consciousness. Now, of course, to my view as a materialist, that doesn't create a problem. And this is just one of many things we don't know. And I assume that either we're going to find an answer or not, because I'm not, as you know, I don't assume that just because we're looking for answers to certain questions, we're going to find them. We may or may not.
You don't think that there's a special problem beyond just the ordinary I don't know in the question of how subjectivity can exist in matter?
No, I don't. That's why
See, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Well, you're not alone. But that's why I reject David Chalmers, not Alan Chalmers. Alan Chalmers is a philosopher of science. He's a really interesting guy. But that's why I reject David Chalmers' so-called hard problem of consciousness. I don't think there is a hard problem of consciousness. I think there is a problem of consciousness for sure, but I don't think it's hard in the sense that he means it. Now, Nagel disagrees, and he basically thinks that there is in fact a hard problem that science is unequipped to deal with, and then now he goes in a different direction from Chalmers. Chalmers basically espouses a mild version of dualism. Nagel says that there is some kind of major principle that modern science is still missing, and it's possible. I mean, I
don't think that either. I mean, I think it's a hard problem in that it's a conceptual problem. I think the answer is going to be Wittgensteinian ultimately, and it's going to require a very subtle way of understanding how viewpoint and how we look at things. But so we might not disagree that much, but I don't want to get too far off it. This one last thing about this, I feel like I'm badgering, but I don't yet quite see it. So you say that there is a sense in asking, what is it for?
Yeah.
Or what is a process for in the case of biology, right? But not in the other cases. Why can't I say, let's say I'm talking about geological effects, that certain geological effects are for creating a riverbed?
Because you're introducing something that is unnecessary, right? So scientists tend to be parsimonious about or they should be at least, parsimonious about their metaphysics and about their explanatory, the way in which they explain things. I mean, a river is the way it is because the physical chemical processes at the geological level that create rivers work that way, and there is no additional, once that I describe the geological processes, once that I describe the chemistry and physics of the materials involved and how the water, works on rocks and things like that, then there is nothing else that needs to be explained. I have a complete explanation of why a river, is formed in a certain way. On the other hand, if I were to give you a complete biochemical explanation, account of how hemoglobin exchanges carbon dioxide and oxygen, you would still have a very good question. But why does that happen inside living organisms? And if I say, well, it just
so
happens,
they can respirate, or say they can.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. If I say, well, it just happens, then I'm obviously missing a big chunk of what's going on there.
There is almost, it sounds to me like you're saying one has to be somewhat realist in the philosophical sense about the system in biology in a way that you don't in the other sciences. You can view it as a system, but you don't have to be a realist about the system. In other words,
correct.
And it seems to me, I mean, this may connect back to the discussion we had about Sellers. It seems to me that where that sort of talk comes is when you interpret the scientific image in terms of the manifest, right? Yes. So when we look at the world and we interpret what the geologists are doing, we do naturally do things like, oh, it did that, and that's what created the riverbed, right?
Right.
And we view the sort of the geological system as a system, but we don't have to be realists about it as a system within the scientific image, right?
Exactly. And if we go that way, if we fall for the temptation of going realist for systems that don't actually require that approach, then we engage into what I suspect is fuzzy thinking, such as the Gaia hypothesis.
I don't think it's fuzzy thinking, as long as we're operating in the manifest image. I mean, and I do think we said last time that inevitably, because we are human, we interpret the results of the scientific image in terms of the manifest image, but we have to be careful. Right. Just like we shouldn't import pieces of the scientific image piecemeal into the manifest, we certainly shouldn't go in the other direction.
Exactly.
Important. Okay, so let's now focus, strictly speaking, on biology, because I did have another thing I wanted to ask you. And so, in Aristotle, there are no final causes without formal causes. In other words, purpose and form go together. As a matter of fact, for Aristotle, you can read a thing's purpose off of its form. Right. And inversely, he says purpose is actually prior to all the other causes. Right. Lyre playing is the reason why there are lyres, right? And the reason why lyres have the shape and form and properties that they do. And given that we've agreed that Aristotle is not, at least in his science, full-blown teleological, in the sense that it implies intention, would you say that in modern biology we also recover the formal cause?
Oh, that's a good question. So no, I don't think so.
Explain now. So how is that possible? How can you have a final cause without a formal cause?
Well, that's, I think, the major difference between teleology and teleonomy.
Okay, go on.
So now that you put it, in fact, I haven't thought about it that way, but now that you put it that way, it's kind of interesting.
I warned you. I sent it in the email.
Yeah, I know. But I didn't really process it until you actually just put it this way. So, and I think you have a good point there, that it's going to be helpful, again, to separate the biological sciences from the social sciences. Because in the social sciences, you do have, in fact, both the formal cause.
I agree with that.
And the final cause, right? As you just say, the economic systems are there for a purpose, and they are actually instantiated in a certain way because somebody has a purpose in mind.
That's right.
But in the case of biological systems, that's not the case. There is if we want to talk about a final cause, and the final cause is the process of natural selection, which aims at maximizing, survival and reproduction. But it's not the equivalent. It's not something that, that doesn't imply that things have to go in a particular way, that there is some kind of a form that is already present before the final outcome is out. The natural selection is a very much a contingent process. It works with whatever it's available locally, and it's not even an optimizing process, arguably. It's what...
Right, you said that last time. You said it's not particularly efficient. I asked you whether it's efficient, and you said it isn't. Yeah,
it isn't. There's a lot of waste in the biological world. I mean, just think about the obvious statistic. 99%+ of all species that ever existed went extinct.
That's certainly not efficient.
Yeah, it's definitely not efficient. I mean, sometimes natural selection looks a bit more like a Ruby Goldberg machine than or the outcome of natural selection. Now, it's not quite that bad as a Ruby Goldberg machine, because there is a certain degree of efficiency, because otherwise other organisms that are going to be slightly more efficient in doing certain things are going to outcompete you. And therefore,
there's relative efficiency, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
There is relative efficiency.
yeah.
Major drive here is relative fitness. How well are you doing compared to anybody who is competing with you in your own environment for your own resources? So, but natural selection is not an optimizing process. It's what is much more akin to what economists call a satisficing process. That is,
Explain that.
It doesn't have to get you in the best possible, so let's say engineering. Let's say we're talking about the heart again, or right. So the vertebrate heart, mammalian heart as four-chambered, but it hasn't always been like that. In evolution, the heart started out as a much simpler thing with 2 chambers, and then 3 chambers, and then 4 chambers. That shows that natural selection works by step. It didn't arrive at the best possible outcome immediately, and in fact, even the current outcome is not the best possible one, because, as you know, there are all sorts of things that can go wrong with a heart. If you are into science fiction, you might think that either the Klingons of Star Trek or Doctor Who have a much better solution because they have 2 hearts.
Right.
So if the first one fails, they have a second one, and that's.
We also have redundant systems, right? For that purpose.
We do have redundant systems, but not.
You can live with 1 kidney. You can live with 1 lung. You can.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. But that actually is the result mostly of the fact that we have bilateral symmetry in our bodies more than anything else. There are certain structures of which we don't have 2, and if we lose it, we're done. The heart being the obvious example.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's certainly not ideal or perfect by any or optimized by any standard. What it is, however, it's good enough. It does the job, and it does the job, more importantly, better than any alternative that had been around before. Right. So 4-chambered heart animals have outcompeted and done well compared to 3 chambers and 2-chambered ones. And that's all that matters in terms of natural selection. There's no,
But is there not a
one way?
let me ask you: is there not a fundamental? Is there not a basic form though that anything that performs this function would have to have?
Oh yeah, sure.
Or is it really indeterminate?
It's.
That's the issue, right?
It's in between. It's not quite that determinate, but it's not quite indeterminate either. So that what you're talking about then is what biologists refer to as developmental constraints. So there is only a certain number of ways in which you can do certain things with certain materials. So the classic example is why is it impossible to have flying pigs? Well, because wings, typically,
It took me a second to catch up to that. Then, of course, pigs have wings.
That's right.
Exactly.
So the problem with flying pigs, the way in which they're normally depicted, is that they have, the 4 limbs and then the two wings, right? But the wings, every time the wings evolved in vertebrates, they actually replaced the 4 limbs, right? And so you can't have them both ways. And why not? Well, that's because the vertebrate body plan, it's called in biology, referred to as in biology, works that way. And there are basically no exception. There seem to be developmental constraints, such as either with the 4 limbs, you either use them as limbs or you use them as wings, but you can't do both.
Right.
So,
although that's not generally true, right? There are animals for which flippers can also serve as feet, right? Animals that are both in the water then can come out and walk around.
But they work actually suboptimally for both purposes, right? So that's
gotcha.
So there are some fish, for instance, who are kind of able to, they live at the interface between water and land, and they're kind of able to, hop around a little bit. But clearly, they're not doing very well. They kind of look funny that way.
Yeah.
Now, it's also the case, however, that the same constraint does not apply to other body plans. If you're an insect, for instance, you don't have that problem because insects have 3 segments, and so they can play. They have more interplay between limbs and wings. Their wings are constructed in a different way, developmentally speaking. So there are some constraints on biological form. So it's not natural selection can't do whatever it wants, basically. But those constraints are not absolute, meaning that there's some leeway in the way in which an organism can be put together. But the other interesting thing is the more time passes in evolution, Stephen Jay Gould famously argued, the more the constraints become relevant. Because if you study, let's say, the common ancestors of all vertebrates was probably much more developmentally flexible than modern vertebrates, because it had a number of different options. And then it went down certain kind of ways, certain lineages. And once those lineages have done away with additional segments, let's say, and therefore multiple limbs or things like that, that's it. Then you're done. There's nothing else. It's very hard to go back and retrace.
So you say that the more advanced an organism, the more it might make sense to speak of formal causes?
I wouldn't go quite that far.
Because the functions that these things are served are increasingly can only be served by a constrained set of forms.
Right. But that's true. But first of all, it's actually, most biologists would be resistant to use of the word advanced. It's just like evolutionary later. Because it doesn't,
advance is a value judgment.
It's a value judgment. Stephen Jay Gould famously reminded us, it's like, we're so proud of being sort of the owners of the planet and all that.
The cockroaches, insects are the owners of the planet.
Or even better, the bacteria.
Bacteria, right.
In terms of biomass, bacteria way outperform us.
Yeah.
They've been around forever.
Yeah. The reason I'm pushing on this so hard is because eventually, I mean, this will matter when we cross over into ethics, right? And so, I mean, famously, the idea for Aristotle is that the relationship between the final cause and the formal cause, between ends and forms, is that ends are uniquely served by certain forms, right? And so the reason why the relationship between in a human being between that which we are for, which is, let's say, civic life, right, is directly related to that which defines our form, and that is that we are defined in terms of rational cognition, right? And so, it's important if you think, as you obviously don't, which you're going to get to next, but if you think that it's important in order to recover a modern virtue ethic, that we recover some modern notion of teleology, of purpose, then the question is raised as to, well, what's the relevant form, right? What's the relevant essential property of human nature that's going to make that purpose possible.
So we go to Anscombe then, because the question then is, so I really like that her paper, and of course, as you said, it's been very influential.
It's provocative. It opens everything up. You start asking things, and
absolutely. But the conclusion itself is like made me wary immediately. Like so she says, okay, well. So modern approaches like the ontology suffer from the fact that they try to do away with the concept of a lawgiver, and they can't function that way. Virtue ethics isn't going to work because it tries to do away with the Aristotelian concept of ultimate causes or teleology, and that's not tenable anymore. And so
unless we recover some modern version of it, which she's open to, but doesn't think it's going to be as easy as everybody thinks it might be.
And so her conclusion is, well, we should stop doing moral philosophy and do, as you put it, philosophy of psychology. Yeah. Well, first of all, that's not practical. We can't stop doing moral philosophy.
we can't stop. We can't stop. Wait a minute. I don't know about that. We can't stop employing the moral idiom in our daily lives, but we could stop producing moral theories, right? I mean, we could do that.
Sure.
I mean, philosophers could, they could do something else. They could dig ditches or write violin concertos or something useful,
That's true. I suppose that's true. But I just don't think it's very
As a guy who just wrote a book on ethics, you're not too keen on that idea.
No, exactly. I'm not too keen on that.
So why do you think she's wrong about the latter point? Let's not go on the divine lawgiver. That's not what we're on. Why do you think you don't need teleology to do modern virtue ethics?
Well, I think because I actually think that she makes the same mistakes in both cases, if I may. I know she's I know she's a big name in moral philosophy, but I do think that she makes, in fact, exactly the same mistake in both cases.
Go ahead.
Which is a confusion between the historical roots of something and the necessary condition for that something, right? So when she says,
and if she does, McIntyre certainly does. I mean, he more emphasizes the genealogies of these traditions. Correct. So go ahead,
But that's the problem with genealogies in general. So I just finished an introductory philosophy course where we talked about Nietzsche, genealogy of morals. And it seems to me that Nietzsche's project is undermined by the same basic mistake. That is, he's right that you can show that the concept of morality and the use of the word morality has a genealogy. It has changed over time, and it's different in different cultures and different times. But that doesn't undermine the validity of certain concepts, at least, or certain versions of the concept. It just tells you that the concept has a history. Yeah, no kidding. We're talking about human culture, so it has to have a history. But one of the things about human culture is precisely that we're capable of discerning what is good and what is bad about our ancestors' ideas, and you throw away the bad stuff and keep the good one and keep working on it. Let me give you an example from science. So I was interested. I got interested in this thing because a couple of years ago, somebody whose name now escapes me, but for our listeners, we can put a link to an article, to a post that I wrote about this specific issue that I'm about to introduce in a minute. So I've been interested in the origin of the idea of natural law in science. Forget morality for a minute, just in science. So Newton talks about the laws of physics. Modern physicists talk about the laws of physics. But of course, if you ask Stephen Weinberg or Stephen Hawking or anybody like that today, they would definitely say, no, we don't mean that there is a lawgiver. What we mean by laws of physics is that the world is structured in such a way that certain regularities are without exceptions. Okay, that gravity works no matter where in the universe, no matter what you do to it, and so on and so forth, right? That the atomic decay works in a particular way, etc., etc. But Newton did mean that the laws of physics came from a lawgiver,
right? Because he was at least a deist, if not
he was
theist.
at least a deist, if not more. Yeah. Now, apparently, and we're going to put the link to a short post that I wrote about this thing a couple of years ago. I heard of a talk here at the Graduate Center at CUNY University by somebody who was tracing the idea of laws of nature, and they would say that there was a debate early on in at the onset of modern physics in the 17th and 18th centuries. Galileo, for instance, apparently was very wary of talk about laws of nature, unlike Descartes, who today we know as a philosopher, but at the time he thought of himself just as much as a physicist, right? And so there was a debate there, and Galileo was kind of wary and said, no, wait a minute now. If we're talking about laws, we're bringing in something that sounds a little too sort of essentially religious, teleological, et cetera, right? Now, so at the beginning of modern physics, there was a debate. Major physicists, figures like Descartes and Newton went and used the term laws of nature explicitly meaning that these laws were coming from a lawgiver. Modern science has abandoned that talk, and yet it has retained the concept of a law of nature, just reinterpreting it in a more mechanistic way, right?
Right.
So that is my analogy, that I don't see a reason, certainly I don't see a reason in either Anscombe or McIntyre, why moral philosophy can't do the same.
Can I give you a reason? Can I say why I think they do?
Yes, of course.
So you've done this before, and you've also given the example of laws of logic. And here now, look, I mean, they may be wrong about this, but I don't think they're making this mistake. And I would be surprised if someone like Anscombe, who was also a very tough analytic philosopher, would make this sort of mistake. In her opinion, the modern notion of obligation, ought, has a connotation of requiredness. That is, that which is required or forbidden.
Right.
And she thinks that in order to sustain that connotation requires a requirer. In other words, it is true that if I want to think if I want to think logically, I have to follow the laws of logic, and that doesn't require a lawgiver. Right. But the laws of logic are not required, and failing to obey them is not forbidden, only relative to certain interests. In other words, both she and McIntyre are suggesting that the modern connotation, the connotation of ought in modern moral philosophy, is that of a categorical imperative, right?
That's right.
Now, if you disagree with that, then right. No. But it's not that you disagree that obligation really is categorical, but whether the common understanding of the modern ought is categorical, and I think it is, just by the way that people speak and the way that people use it. That's why they differentiate obligations from desires, right?
But don't you think that that is a problem for, let's say, a moral realist, but not for anybody else? So I'm not a moral realist in that sense. I don't believe that the laws of morality, just like the laws of logic, for that matter, are sort of written out there. And so to me, they don't imply any kind of categorical imperative. They only imply, I interpret them all as conditional imperatives.
As hypothetical imperatives, yeah. Right.
Yeah, hypothetical imperatives. Right. So only in the sense of, well, if you want to live in a society like ours, you don't go around murdering people. Right. And if you do, we're going to lock you up.
Right. But I think that all that Anscombe is really saying is, and that McIntyre is saying is that, look, if by ought and ought not you mean required and forbidden in a strong sense, then that requires that requires a lawgiver. And what testifies to the fact that it does is that Kant thought it did, which is why he tried to replace the lawgiver with a self-legislator. Which is what Anscombe says you can't do, because the lawgiver has to have more power than the law receiver, and you can't legislate to yourself. She said that that's absurd. So I don't know that she disagrees with you. It's more that she's speaking to what she thinks people commonly mean. And now what you're saying is, look, they may commonly mean that, but that's obligation can't be that, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And so her critique may, in fact, I think does succeed against a sort of a strong, robust notion of Kantianism, right? But not everybody subscribes to that kind of notion.
Right.
And
I agree with
that. It fails, I think, against any version of utilitarianism, because utilitarians are not, they don't sort of imagine that there is this kind of categorical ought.
No, she has a different critique of utilitarianism, which we don't need to get into. That's a separate part of the paper. I mean, half the paper is devoted to criticizing Bentham and Mill and Sidgwick and
as you know, I'm not a utilitarian either. So, but I mean that the point is that particular critique does not even apply to utilitarians.
So let's talk now about why you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to virtue.
About virtue, about why you don't need to recover a modern notion of teleology in order to base
similar
virtue.
Reasons.
Okay, so go through that. Rehearse that.
So even though it's clearly the case that Aristotle meant is teleonomy or teleology, whatever he was doing, there to be fundamental to his virtue, to his version of virtue ethics. Other versions of virtue ethics didn't necessarily require that, The Stoics or the Epicureans, for instance, talked about, let's analyze facts in hand, what it is that makes human beings strive. And
is that a quote? Facts in hand? Well, is that an expression they use? Okay.
No, that's my interpretation. But basically, they said, it's not like there is this ultimate purpose of thing. Epicurus says, look, what is? He asks. This is not not a direct quote, but he asks, what is it that makes human beings, happy or unhappy? Well, pain makes them unhappy. In fact, pain is the major thing that makes them unhappy. This is an empirical observation on his part. Right now, you
don't mean by happy the modern hedonic notion of happy. You're talking about you're talking about eudaemonist notion of happy, right?
That's
okay,
right.
Go on.
So makes their life not worth living or less worthy of living, right? Yes, because otherwise it would be obvious that pain is counter to modern conception of happiness.
Right.
But
then they would just
in the sense of, but in the sense of, the Greek and Roman sense of what kind of life is worth living, Epicurus said, look, it's a matter of fact. If you just go around and observe human beings, they shy away. If there is anything that they shy away from, is pain. And if there is anything that they embrace are simple pleasures of two kinds: simple physical pleasures, like a good meal or a nice little house and that sort of stuff, shelter, and intellectual pleasures, the pleasure of company, of good friendship and things like that. That is so he built his system on what he thought were empirical observations. Now you can of course question empirical observations, right? Because wait a minute. And in fact, the Stoics did. The
Right.
Stoics'
They don't
nature-
all they all looking at the same facts, but they're not coming to the same conclusions about what
Correct.
constitutes flourishing.
Correct. So the major objection the Stoics had, or a major objection the Stoics had to the Epicureans was like, no, my friend, we do all sorts of things on purpose where we go through pain because we think that there is a higher purpose, that there is a better objective. So I go to the gym and that's painful because I think it improves my health, right? Or children, and he said, Epicurus said, it comes naturally, it's sort of instinctive to people to avoid pain. And the Stoics said, no. If you look at child development, the child, when it begins to learn how to walk, it's painful. You can see that it's not enjoying that sort of stuff, but it does it anyway because it's a good thing to learn how to walk. So they disagreed on the empirical, stance, and of course, in general, they were talking about human nature, sure, right? So Epicurus thought that human nature is the nature of an organism that seeks to, certain kinds of pleasures and avoid pains, just like John Stuart Mill, who was in fact heavily influenced by, as we know, by Epicurus, right?
Well, Martha Nussbaum has argued that Mill is more of a eudaemonist than a utilitarian.
I think she's right,
and that Bentham really is the
I think she's right, but of course Mill also was right. If we can open just a parenthesis for a second, because Mill introduced this distinction between higher and lower pleasures, right? With his famous phrase that I find out. By the way, an empirical fact about philosophy.
Pigs.
So I found out, the pigs and Socrates thing. I found out that people are completely split about it. If you tell it to some people, they say, "Oh yeah, of course I get it," and other people say, "No, that's stupid. I don't get it." So the quote is something on the lines. It's not a verbatim quote. Maybe we can post a link to.
It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied.
Right, and if the pig disagrees, that's just because he's not Socrates, right?
Well, because the idea being that a competent judge of the matter is one who's experienced both, right? Who's experienced both.
And people do see that, and I can see that. I can see the objection. People see that, but that's elitist because now what's a competent judge, et cetera, et cetera. Right, but fine. But that was exactly the point that Epicurus was making. Interestingly, Epicurus was actually reacting against the Cyrenaics. The Cyrenaics were a minor sect at the time, minor philosophy at the time, who argued that only physical pleasures are important.
Right.
Okay. And Epicurus said, no.
They were hedonists in the sense that people modern imply today when they say the word. Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
And so Mill was reacting against Bentham because since Bentham did not make a distinction between lower and higher pleasures, it turns out that if abolishing opera and theater makes and sort of replacing them with soap operas all day for people, on average increases happiness because more people appreciate soap operas.
Then that's what we should do, right?
And that's what we should do. And Mill said, "Wait a minute, no, hold on." Right. So now they were all talking, however, about human nature. So Epicurus saw human nature in a particular way. The Stoics saw human nature in another way. The Cyrenaics had a different opinion, and so on and so forth. But none of these opinions, I think, requires, in a modern sense, a robust notion of teleology. You don't have to say that that's the way human nature was, sort of kind of predetermined somehow from the beginning of the universe, or that is the way it has to be. Human nature is actually pliable. My view of human nature is very similar to Hume. Hume wrote this wonderful essay on human nature, where he says that there are, I'm going to paraphrase it and put it in modern terms, but basically this is what he says. He said, look, there are certain things that are basic to being a human being, and those come from, as we will say today, from our biology. So we have certain instincts, fear, love of our caretakers, and things like that. Those are just instinctive. They just come with being a human being. We have a capacity for aggression. We also have a capacity for reason and compassion. We have a capacity for cooperation, but we also have a capacity for selfishness, right? And then he says, but then society comes in, so culture comes in, and then you can shape these things. And you can shape them in a way that literally alters human nature, meaning that modern human nature, as opposed to, let's say, the Pleistocene, right, it's the result of an intricate combination of biology and culture. And if so, then it's pliable to some extent, at least, right? So I don't subscribe to a sort of a fixed view of human nature, but I don't think you need it. If you want to be a virtual ethicist today, all you have to say is like, look, human beings are so construed and human societies are so construed that if you behave in certain ways, you're going to be a better person, meaning that you are contributing to society and at the same time you're getting satisfaction from what you're doing. And really, that's all there is to it. So it becomes, let's not forget that the word morality, right, comes from the Latin moralis, which was the way in which Cicero translated the word ethikos from the Greek. And both words refer to human customs and habits, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about human customs and habits. Ethics is the study of the best human customs and habits. Best in what sense? Best in the sense of furthering both societies flourishing and individual flourishing within society. Why both? Because we're inherently social animals, and so we can't flourish if society at large doesn't flourish. And to me, that's all there is to it. There's nothing more deep, more profound, more sort of basic than that. But I find it enough.
But let me ask you something. So I'm starting to wonder whether it's a bit oversimplistic to refer to all the Greeks as eudaimonists, because eudaimonia, as I define it when teaching Aristotle, means human excellence or human flourishing. Now, those are inherently functional concepts, right? I mean, if I say to you, if I present you with some device, and you have no idea what it is, and I say, well, this is an excellent, what's it? That literally doesn't mean anything until you know what's it's are for, right?
No, you're absolutely right.
So, are you suggesting maybe that we're a bit too loose when we talk about Aristotle and Epicurus and Zeno and all these guys as being eudaimonists?
Yes.
Is that really not really correct?
Well, correct is,
or is it oversimplified?
I think it's oversimplified. I certainly think it's oversimplified. So I think that if you want to use eudaimonia in the strict sense of excellence, human excellence according to human function, that basically is just Aristotle and nobody else, pretty much, as far as I can tell. Even Socrates.
Not even Plato.
Well, maybe Plato, arguably Plato.
But maybe. Not Socrates, certainly not Socrates.
But not necessarily Socrates, right?
Yeah,
the late Plato, but not the early.
The more the metaphysical Plato.
The more metaphysical Plato. The more metaphysical Plato and Aristotle, for very different reasons, because of course, as you know, Aristotle went in a very different direction. He rejected the idea of the forms and all that sort of stuff. But for very different metaphysical reasons, I think the late Plato and Aristotle are the only ones that are strictly speaking eudaimonic in the sense of excellence, human excellence. The rest, including these two, however, are broadly speaking Socratic. Even the Epicureans, who actually rejected Socrates, I mean, they were reacting.
No, but I know what you mean by Socratic. This is really very interesting. I don't think people appreciate this at all. This is even philosophers, I don't think, appreciate this.
Yeah, right. It's not widely appreciated.
Yeah.
Right. So they were all Socratic in the sense that some of them explicitly considered themselves Socratic. The Stoics were often referred to as Socratic. And they did not reject the label. They didn't use it, explicitly in their own writings because they didn't feel that sort of they were worthy of that kind of, of taking over the mantle. Also because there were other people, including the Platonists, who were obviously wanted the mantle of of Socrates. But they were Socratic, certainly in the broad sense of the term. And even the Epicureans, who actually rejected, they put themselves in contraposition to Socrates in many respects. They're still derived, intellectually speaking, they're derived from the Socratic tradition. So all of the Hellenistic schools, I think, were Socratic in this broad sense. So if one wants to use the word eudaimonia in a looser sense, or I would say in a more modern sense, remember that even positive psychologists, God bless their heart, as they say in the South, use the word eudaimonia, right? But they use it in terms of, in the broader sense of human flourishing, not just human excellence, right? So human excellence, I think, is a very specific type of flourishing. But we can agree that human beings flourish outside of the concept of excellence.
Because excellence presupposes an idealization, an idealization, right? Yes. A very solid notion of a determinate end. Whereas flourishing can be employed to simply speak to a commonly recognized condition, right? And so in that sense, the Socratic, what you're calling the Socratic, that then the later eudaimonists are more like, interestingly enough, than Plato or Aristotle are, is that they're not speaking of flourishing relative to a kind of an idealization that's derived from a metaphysics. It's really, they're talking about flourishing within the common ways in which human beings live and operate.
That's right. That is certainly the way in which Cicero meant it, and Cicero considered himself actually a late Platonist, right? An academic skeptic, basically.
Yeah.
But he was also very sympathetic to the Stoics. And as you know, we're working together now with Sky Cleary on the possibility of editing a book on different sort of philosophies of life, right? And that's one reason why one of my disagreements with the with the actual original Stoics is that the original Stoics, just like any other Hellenistic philosophy, they were trying to make arguments that their philosophy was the philosophy to go. It was the way to go, right?
Oh, so the Greeks, the Zeno and his gang, were not ecumenical in the way that you characterize the later Stoics as being.
No, they were not ecumenical, and neither were the Epicureans or the Cyrenaics or any of those others. They thought they were having these really strong debates because they thought they had the right way of looking at things and everybody else was wrong. I think that a modern Stoic, at least the way I see modern Stoicism, is ecumenical in the sense that, look, for me, there is a plurality of ways in which human beings can flourish. I don't think there is anything wrong for somebody today to say, look, I'm an Epicurean. I don't think that social and political engagement is worth it. I rather concentrate on my friends and family and live a simple life. Fine, my friend. If that makes you flourish and you don't kill anybody and you don't go, bombing anybody or anything like that, I mean, that's perfectly fine.
Right.
Now, I disagree, meaning that for me, political engagement is important. So Stoicism, which has embedded that concept, is actually a better philosophy. Other people can be Buddhists and do kind of a little bit of between those two, et cetera, et cetera. There's a number of possibilities.
It's not really a disagreement. It's because flourishing, if you look at it as a sort of the common well-being of people as we commonly understand it, is quite heterogeneous.
Exactly.
And there may be people who simply are not suited to enter into politics,
That's right.
like the president.
Now, what that said, so that said, so I don't want to go over to the opposite extreme and say anything goes.
No, so it's not relativistic, right?
I mean, I do think that there are some philosophies of life, let's say the obvious candidate, Nazism,
that are just destructive of every form of human life. Yeah,
they don't bring flourishing in any meaningful sense of the term.
Yeah, this is really so interesting because, it actually gets at something. I had so many things I wanted to ask you when we did the Stoicism thing that I had to leave some out, but I'm going to bring one of them up now because it really does, what you just said kind of answers it. Now I have to think about whether I fully accept it, but it really does answer it. I was going to ask you why you gravitated towards Hellenistic philosophies, given that both Hellenistic philosophy and Hellenistic art are considered inferior to the classical period. Right. And if and actually I think that the art history is very instructive in this regard because the Hellenistic is considered a degeneration from the classical precisely because it's pathos-filled. It abandons the formal perfection and symmetries and other qualities that the classical art has, and the same is true of the philosophies. And I said, why would you pick philosophies that were adopted in the decline of civilizations at a time when we are experiencing the greatest prosperity? So that was one of the things I was going to push you on. But now I think what you're saying is really interesting, and that is the only reason why we think of the classical philosophy and the classical art as superior is because of a kind of Platonic bias, right?
That's right. Exactly.
Both in art amongst art historians and philosophers.
That's right.
And if you don't take sort of the notion of idealization first and instantiation second, but say no, instantiation is everything, right?
Exactly.
And the extent to which we idealize, we pull out from the instantiation, then it makes perfect sense.
Right.
Why
I
you
mean,
would
there is a reason, and it's an ironic one, why my blog is called Footnotes to Plato, right? I'm not a Platonist, but I do recognize that Plato is everywhere,
Yeah.
for good and for ill. And,
Yeah.
we're still responding to him. We're still in dialogue with him, which, of course, some modern scientifically oriented people think that's what's wrong with philosophy. You guys are still talking to Plato. And I think this is what's wonderful about philosophy, that I'm still in dialogue with Plato, Aristotle, Hume, Locke, Mill, and all these other people. I'm having, as Seneca would put it, conversations with the most interesting minds in the world every day, every time that I open a book.
I think that I will tell you, I mean, just as an aside, I think that there is an academic paper in this point about eudaimonisms.
Yeah, possibly. Right.
Because I can't think of too many people I've heard talk about this way and say, look, excellence and flourishing can mean very different things, and maybe we're being a bit overly simplistic and just simply referring to all the Greek ethics as eudaimonist or virtue ethics or whatever.
Right.
What the Stoics meant by it is very different from what Aristotle means, right? And we see it here in this, if you're right, then the Stoics don't need a notion of form or function in the sense that Aristotle does. They simply need to examine sort of common human ways of life, right?
Exactly.
Forms of life. And now, let me just ask you one last thing. And I don't want to bring him up, but I will. I mean, can you
careful because we're already beyond an hour, I think. So.
Sam Harris.
Oh gosh, yes. What about him?
Well, it sounds to me like one way of describing what you're saying is that we can simply sort of read our ethics off of an empirical investigation of how actual people do well and do poorly. And isn't that simply what he says? That we can get our ethics without doing much philosophy, just simply by looking empirically at human life. And since we're not talking about excellence in a metaphysical sense, but we're just talking about, what tends to create well-being, as he calls it, and what doesn't. So are we perhaps being unfair to him?
No way.
So to maybe differentiate for a second, why aren't you saying that?
Yeah, so here's why. There's two reasons why I think that Sam is mistaken. One is, and I've talked and written about this before, so we can probably add links, and I'm going to be very brief about it. One reason is because he has an agenda. He wants to say this is a matter of science, not just empirical evidence. It's about science. But he defines right at the beginning of his book, The Moral Landscape, he defines science in such an extensive way that no philosopher of science will actually recognize. That basically makes it coincide with the totality of human reason or empirically informed reasoning, right? And so that, if you follow him there, the fact that later this afternoon I'm going to go downtown Manhattan, taking the Q subway and then getting off at a particular stop, that means I'm doing science because I'm doing empirically informed reasoning. That to me is just ridiculous. It's like, sorry, I'm not going to go there. So that's one trivial reason why he's wrong. A more interesting reason is that I think ethics is underdetermined by the empirical evidence, by science, quote unquote. So the very fact
is that why you're ecumenical? Precisely because?
Yes, that's right. Precisely because of that, right?
Yep.
So because science, if we're talking about actual scientific questions, such as what's the temperature of the sun at the surface or something like that, well, there's only one answer there. It's not, you're not going to have, you may or may not know it. You may or may not be able to determine it with precision, but there's going to be one answer. End of story. No such thing will ever be the case for human ethics. Right? You're not going to be able to say, to read off the ethics straight out of facts about human beings, which is what he wants to do. Now, does that mean that the empirical facts are not relevant? Of course they're relevant, because as I just said, ethics is actually how we behave in a society, and society is structured in a certain way. It's a result of certain aspects of human nature. All of those are empirical facts. To use I can't believe I'm going to use Sartre here, but to use Sartre's, existential terminology, there is a facticity about life. There is a number of conditions, of things that constrain what you want to do, what you can't do.
Right.
And those things, you cannot ignore them. You can't ignore the facticity. And in fact, the facticity is obviously going to inform our ethics. But the very fact that we can have thriving and flourishing people who considered themselves Kantian, mild utilitarians, Epicureans, Cyrenaics, Stoics, etc., 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 Buddhists, Christians, Jews, all of that sort of stuff. That means to me that there is no univocal answer, that the empirical evidence grossly, to some extent, it constrains the ethics, but it doesn't.
There are negative conditions, but there are no sufficient conditions in a sense,
exactly.
right? I mean, there are clearly, as you pointed out with Nazism, ethical systems that are interfering of all flourishing, right?
Correct.
As is commonly understood.
Correct.
But there's nothing that's required, so to speak, in a positive way.
Exactly, which means you're not going to have scientific answers to moral questions. Now, does that mean that empirical evidence in general, right? I think, unlike Sam, I think that empirical evidence is much, much broader than science. But does that mean that empirical evidence in general, and even science in particular, aren't going to be helpful to clarify moral questions? Of course they are. Yes, but no moral philosopher, I think, would disagree. I mean, my example, I believe I brought up this example when I reviewed Sam's book in Skeptic magazine. I said, look, let's say we're having a discussion about the permissibility of abortion, and we agree that abortion is going to be permissible up until the moment in which the fetus begins to feel pain, and not afterwards, unless there are extreme circumstances such as endangering the life of the mother. Okay, well, clearly science can tell us when is that moment. When is it that what's our best guess as in terms of the developmental biology of the human fetus for when that happens? That clearly is a scientific answer, which is very useful to the ethical debate. But we've already decided that there's a criterion there that is clearly not empirical. It's like, okay, we're going to agree that pain is the criterion to go by, but somebody goes, well, why pain? Why pain in a fetus as opposed to something else? And those questions are not going to be. You're not going to do an experiment that tells you why pain.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, to a certain extent, you agree with the evidence base that Harris thinks ethics rests upon. The mistake is all on the moral philosophy side, that he just thinks it entails utilitarianism. And,
that's right.
And you think it clearly, obviously, doesn't entail just utilitarianism.
Doesn't. I mean, look, if we're talking about making a connection between the empirical world and ethics, hey, the Stoics did exactly that. When we talked about Stoicism, and we said that the Stoics were studying what they call physics and what they call logic in the service of ethics, right? In the service of their study of how to live your life. By physics, they meant all of the natural sciences and metaphysics. Why? Because they thought that understanding how the world works is obviously relevant to ethics. But why logic also? Because they also understood that, yes, but you also have to reason well about that evidence. Otherwise, you're not going to come up with correct conclusions or workable conclusions.
Right.
So they said, if the idea that Sam has been proposing is simply that moral philosophy can meaningfully be informed by empirical evidence, by how the world works. Well, my friend, people have done that for at least close to 2.5 millennia. So it's nothing new under the sun in that sense.
Well, Massimo, we did it again. Really interesting, and it went in directions I did not expect. I mean, gosh, we went all the way from modern biology to whether or not there's a single eudaimonism or several. So, I mean, I think that's really interesting. Thank you very much. And
it was a pleasure.
Continued success with your book, which I understand is really doing very well. And I encourage people to get it. And there'll be a link, of course. And I will see you next time around these parts.
All right.
All right, Massimo. Thank you. Bye-bye.